Tonight, the NATO summit, questions over the war in Ukraine and the escalating situation in the Middle East, but all overshadowed by one man, President Donald Trump. Well, the head of NATO calls the US president Daddy as he praises Trump for the Iran-Israel ceasefire. Keir Starmer and NATO allies, including Trump, agree an ironclad commitment to collective defence and to raise military spending to 5% of GDP. Back here, though, ministers dismiss the mounting rebellion over benefit cuts and insist the government will press ahead with next week's vote on its flagship welfare bill. And as the gates open for Glastonbury, we'll raise a glass of scrumpy to politicians and political journalists too, who let their hair down in the green fields. All that and more with two people who never get lost on the way back from the Pyramid stage, Tom Purtzglove and Hannah Bardell. They'll be with us for the next hour. It's Wednesday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. NATO leaders have agreed to raise their defence spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, in a move that President Donald Trump says is a monumental win for him and for Western civilization. The US president and his NATO allies confirmed what they're calling their ironclad commitment to collective defence at the end of an unusually brief summit in The Hague today. But unlike in previous years, there was no condemnation of Russia's war in Ukraine or mention of a pathway to NATO membership for Ukraine either. Well, in just a moment, we'll hear the view from Washington and our US correspondent, Mark Stone. But first, we can go live to The Hague and speak to Sky's security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who's been speaking to the US president. Deborah, what did he have to say?
Yeah, so he gave a press conference, as all US presidents do. It's like the landmark, the highlight, really, of these summits. And he took fielded a lot of questions about what went on in the room. You'll remember that yesterday, when he arrived here in The Hague, on board his plane, he appeared to raise questions about the US commitment to this Article 5 founding principle of the NATO alliance, that an attack on one is an attack on all. And this is something that all allies have been trying to stop Donald Trump from even mentioning any sort of doubt over whether or not he supports Article 5. And they have been bending over backwards with flattery and wooing him, and also, most importantly, signing up to this new defence spending pledge to lift the amount of money they spend on defence and security to 5% of GDP. And it does, frankly, seem to have had an effect, because he did say when he arrived that, you know, he sort of, I can't remember the exact words, but he was basically giving the sense that, you know, he had to come to NATO. But once he got here, he said that he was really moved by the language of the leaders, how they all cared about their nations, how he is, you know, really pleased to see these commitments to spend more and rely less on the United States. And it was in this context that I asked him a question about the signals he's getting from his allies, and whether ultimately he wants to see NATO, Europe and Canada all stepping up and being able to defend themselves without the United States. This is how the exchange went.
Hello. Deborah Haynes from Sky News.
Good.
Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, who is your friend, he called you Daddy earlier. Do you regard your NATO allies as kind of children?
No, he likes me. I think he likes me. If he doesn't, I'll let you know. I'll come back and I'll hit him hard, okay? No? He did it very affectionate. Daddy, you're my daddy.
Do you regard your NATO allies, though, as kind of like children? And they're obviously listening to you and they're spending more, and you're obviously appreciative of that. But do you hope that actually they're going to be able to defend themselves, defend Europe on their own?
I think they need help a little bit at the beginning, and I think they'll be able to. And I think they're going to remember this day. And this was a big day for NATO. You know, this was a very big day. They took it. One of the gentlemen said, you know what? We've been trying to raise money raise the rate for 30 years, he said, 20 years, from almost the beginning. And he's been there for a long time. He said, until you came along, it never happened. What you did is amazing. It's been sort of an amazing day for a lot of reasons, but also for that. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think they can do it without you, though, in the future? Can they do it without
Well, ask Mark.
States?
I mean, you have to ask Mark, okay?
I thought it was really interesting. He was making very clear that he doesn't think that Europe would be able to defend themselves, which implicitly indicates that he is still prepared to help defend Europe, which will be music to the ears of a lot of allies, including in the UK. But the reason why I asked that question in the first place was because Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, did use that rather strange language when he was talking. He was sitting with Donald Trump. They were having a sort of a press moment. Donald Trump was talking about his efforts to end Israel's war with Iran, and Mark Rutte then called him daddy, which is kind of a strange language to use. There's sort of an example of the flattery that you're hearing coming from the NATO chief. You'll remember that text message that he sent to Donald Trump yesterday that Donald Trump then posted on social media, in which there was gushing language praising Donald Trump for all the work that he's done to rally NATO allies to spend more. And I asked Mark Rutte about that too, whether, why is he using this flattering language? Is that the only way you can do business with Donald Trump? Isn't it a bit demeaning? And actually, I thought that Mark Rutte's response was pretty clear too. He said, when it comes to defence spending, if it hadn't been for him.
Debs, I honestly can't get over that daddy comment. I just feel like I'm living in a parallel universe. But it does, I guess, show, as you said, that Donald Trump is almost kind of master of all he surveys at NATO, with everyone kind of vying for his affection, if you like. The one other thing I did want to ask you about as well, though, is Ukraine, because we have had these NATO meetings before that have really resulted in a much more emphatic declaration of support for Ukraine. What's happened here?
Yes, it was really stark, actually. I mean, it was the Donald Trump show here today, but over the past 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it's really been all about Volodymyr Zelensky and allies showing support to him. Instead, the Ukrainian president, he was here, but he cut a much more of a sidelined figure. There was no mention in the NATO communique about any pathway to NATO membership. There was never a suggestion that there would be, frankly, given that Donald Trump has ruled that out. But I think most importantly, in that declaration that the allies signed up to, there was also no clear condemnation at all of Russia's full-scale invasion. And that previously, last year, when Joe Biden hosted NATO allies in Washington, there was very stark language condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. And clearly this is all in the backdrop of Donald Trump trying to secure a peace deal in Ukraine. And that's something that so far has even eluded the daddy.
Thank you very much indeed, Deborah Haynes there, who, of course, has been talking to Donald Trump today. Well, let's bring in our US correspondent, Mark Stone. Daddy Trump, then, how's he been getting on today?
That was a moment. We're obviously a few hours behind you here in DC and behind The Hague. And so I woke up, the first video I watched this morning was that, Mark Rutte calling Donald Trump daddy. I mean, there's a little bit of context to it because what Donald Trump was doing was using an analogy he's used quite a few times before with kids in a playground. And Trump said, and he's actually used this regarding Putin and Zelensky, but in this context, he was talking about Israel and Iran, and he said, sometimes you've got to just let these kids fight it out for a few days. And that's the point at which Rutte, for reasons that, just so cringing, then said, yes, and maybe it takes daddy to use some bad language. Cringe. But it comes off that note, that message that Mark Rutte sent Trump yesterday, which was a private message, which I think every world leader, everyone who deals with Donald Trump, given the character he is, knows that whatever they say to him in private, it's possible that it will end up getting leaked. And so they keep that in mind, whatever they wrote. And so given that, Rutte must have known it might be leaked. Obviously, he'd probably prefer it wasn't. He must have known it might be leaked. The fact that it was meant that he surely would have been prepared that language was okay to go out publicly, and that letter or that note was fawning. But I think that the broader point is, yes, it looks desperate. It does look like that, but NATO is desperate. NATO is desperate to make sure that Donald Trump stays on side, and sycophancy quite often with Donald Trump and flattery is what is needed, maybe even if that ends up being public. But I don't think that Mark Rutte woke up this morning thinking that he was going to be calling Donald Trump daddy.
No, I think that's probably a very, very fair assessment. Mark, thank you very much indeed. Mark Stone there for us in Washington. Now, we've been talking an awful lot about the foreign affairs, as always. Keir Starmer out there in NATO. And, if you ask former prime ministers what surprised them about their time in office, one thing that comes up again and again is how much time they end up spending on foreign policy, summits, international diplomacy, and often war, whether conflicts they are directly involved in or not. And some of the reason that foreign policy ends up taking up so much time is because of the alluring glamour and strut in the international stage, but a lot of it also is because, frankly, look, this stuff is important. And we've seen Keir Starmer focusing, understandably, on the international. The diplomatic dance with Donald Trump, being a champion of Ukraine, committing to more defence spending along with other NATO allies at a time when our security may not always be underwritten by America. But focusing on the international comes with a big risk because things can sour very quickly domestically, even when you've been elected with a thumping great majority. And after being forced to U-turn on winter fuel, Keir Starmer is now facing a rebellion by more than 100 MPs on welfare cuts. And the thing about rebellion is that once MPs break the whip once, it's much easier to do it again. It's really struck me how little political experience Keir Starmer has. He's a relative newbie in Westminster, which, look, don't get me wrong, that often has advantages. But it does mean that he's not steeped in the pure politics of the place. And his team too. It's not their fault, by the way. Labour's been out of power for 14 years. But that means they don't have the experience of government, which levers to pull, how to set the media narrative, and frankly, how to control hundreds of MPs. Because if the PM is going to spend this much time on the international stage, someone's got to have an iron fist back home, strong enough to spot potential rebellions before we get to this point and then squeeze them right back down again. Well, Sky's political editor, Beth Rigby, was in The Hague with the Prime Minister, and she pressed him on the lack of condemnation of Russia's war in Ukraine and on how damaging the rebellion over welfare cuts is to his premiership.
Prime Minister, you say that you will not lose focus on Ukraine, but there's no condemnation of Russia's war on Ukraine in the joint communiqué, something that has been in previous statements when Biden was in the White House. Is that because President Trump didn't want NATO to condemn Putin? And are you disappointed by that? And on your welfare bill back home, it's shaping up to be a huge test of your authority. If you can't govern your party, how do you govern the country? Thank you.
Well, on the question of Ukraine, the position in NATO has not changed, nor has my position changed. In fact, over the last couple of days, I would say in my discussions with leaders, there's been a real resolve that now is the time to push again to get Putin to the table for the unconditional ceasefire. President Zelensky has, for many weeks now, indicated his willingness to go to an unconditional ceasefire. Now is the time for Putin, who's been dragging his heels, to come to the table. And there's been a lot of discussions with other leaders about seizing that moment to push forward on that initiative. On the question of welfare reform, we're committed to reforming our welfare system. It doesn't work. It traps people. And it has to be reformed. And it also has to ensure that we've got a welfare system that is fit for the future. And that is why there will be a vote and we will press ahead with the reforms. Thank you.
We're listening to that exchange with Beth Rigby and the Prime Minister is the Armed Forces Minister, Luke Pollard. Great to have you here. So today it's been confirmed we're going to spend 5% of GDP on defence by 2035. Would this have happened without Donald Trump?
Well, he's certainly been making a case for increasing defence spending for quite some time. I think the new era of threats has largely made the argument persuasive because we know that the United Kingdom, our NATO allies, are facing more threats from Russia in particular, but from increasingly countries like Iran, North Korea, Russia working together, trading weapons to be able to threaten not just our security, but those of our allies. Getting to 5% in 2035 is a really big step for the alliance. But it's not just what we spend, it's how we spend it. And frankly, we have to spend it in a better way to be more interoperable, to basically create more strategic dilemmas for Putin. So he doesn't think about moving his tanks over a border into the Baltic states, say, or threatening our undersea cables, as his spy ships have been doing recently in UK waters.
Let's talk a bit about how we're going to spend it, because I've been trying to work out how within weeks we can go from a target of spending 3.5% of GDP on defence to 5%. And, just looking at it, I think I kind of worked it out because it's not all going on our core defence, is it? 1.5% of it is going on what's termed as resilience and security. So what does that mean?
So NATO will be publishing the details shortly about what that covers. But effectively, the way I view it is you've got your core defence budget, which includes things like intelligence services that keep us safe, that provide war-fighting capabilities. That's what the 3.5% by 2035 will be spending. The extra that gets to 5%, that's the kind of stuff that keeps us safe as a homeland. And at the moment, if you look at the past few decades, we haven't invested enough in our core defence, but we certainly haven't invested enough in the strategic enablers, the things that keep our resilience safe, the things that the civilian population might be more interacting with than a military side. You're going
to have to explain this to me, because I'm kind of coming to this and I'm not really sure what it is. Your national security strategy says one of the things that will count as resilience is energy independence. So what kind of things will we be spending this money on in order to achieve energy independence?
Well, as a government, we've got a clean power mission to get to clean power by 2030. That means decarbonising our grid. But increasingly, that's not just about carbon, it's about energy security. Because if we rely on importing energy from some places that are difficult, then that means that we're not as energy secure. And in the event of a conflict, that insecurity with our energy could be used as a strategic weakness against our nation.
So that's just to be crystal clear then. So spending on renewable energy could be part of this 1.5% of resilience and security for the reasons you've outlined. Is that right?
Well, I mean, we're doing that anyway, but NATO will be publishing the full details very shortly.
Just to be really clear, so the 1.5% on resilience and security, spending on renewable energy could be counted as part of that spend.
Well, NATO will be publishing that full details.
But this is your national security strategy.
Oh, yeah,
you said that you're going to get to 5%. It's a very genuine question. I'm not making a judgment on it. Yeah. Is spending on renewable energy, would that count towards the 1.5%? So
what we need to do is check against the NATO criteria that will be published very shortly, and then people will be able to see what's in there. Our assessment broadly at the moment is that based on the criteria that we've been privy to in those discussions, because it's only just been agreed today, we think we'll be spending around 4.1% with core defence budget and some of those resilience work. Now, that will be a whole range of resilience work that will cover a lot of different sectors. Now, frankly, the UK isn't resilient enough at the moment, and not in any sector.
I get this. But look, wind farms are not exactly tanks and drones, are there? And some people might look at this and think, this is fiddling the books. You're just moving a load of spending that would normally be done by the Department of Energy and putting it under defence.
Well, the full criteria will come out shortly, and that will enable people to take a look at what's in there. But what we have to do is make Britain more resilient.
From the sound of it, it sounds pretty clear that, energy independence, as in spending on renewables, for example, would count as part of this. That's your working assumption.
Well, there's lots of different areas of government spend that could potentially fall within that. Our assessment that we'll publish when the full details come out will start setting that journey. But look, frankly, we haven't spent enough making Britain resilient. We are too vulnerable on our critical systems, energy infrastructure, cyber in particular. Now, we can all do a thing to help on cyber. If everyone watching your show now just updated their operating system, Britain would be safer at the end of their upgrade than they are today. But there's some really serious threats that we're facing on cyber infrastructure, on energy, and on our weak supply chains. So there's lots more we need to do. Now, frankly, if we have a view that the only thing that keeps us safe is those people that work in our military, as brilliant as the men and women are, that's not enough to keep Britain safe. We need a whole of society approach, which includes more resilience from every part of government and every part of society.
You've announced some new jets today. Just explain what's going on there.
Yeah, that's right. So we're buying more F-35 jets. We have an obligation and a commitment as a nation to buy 138 at the lifetime of the programme. And what we're doing is, instead of buying the jets that we use on our aircraft carrier at the moment, which are F-35Bs, now they're the ones with vertical takeoff capability to go up and down. We're buying F-35As. Now they take off as a normal jet does. That means the jets are having to have a greater payload. And in that greater payload, with greater capacity, we'll be joining the NATO nuclear mission, able to fly with US nuclear weapons. Now, the reason that this is important is we're retaining our nuclear weapons in our submarines, our independent nuclear deterrent. But we know that with the increasing threats that Russia is posing, we need to pose more strategic dilemmas for them. And the ability for us to say, not only do we have this increased capacity, but we can move our jets much more visibly than you can move a submarine, because the submarines, for very obvious reasons, need to be quite secret and hidden. So you can message, you can match escalation with Russia, and you can get to the point where we're deterring a war, because ultimately all these weapons, our defence spending, are there to keep us safe and deter conflict, but if necessary, to defeat it.
If I may, I'm just going to ask you about welfare now as well. A huge issue, of course, for so many people in your party. And we know that, at least 123 Labour MPs are planning to vote down the government's welfare bill next week because they're unhappy with the cuts, in particular to payments for disabled people. Is that vote 100% going ahead next week?
Yes, the Deputy Prime Minister confirmed it when she was standing in for the Prime Minister at PMQs today.
OK, that's
We
clear.
will be voting on Tuesday.
That's clear. So about 30% of your party in Parliament are saying that they are unhappy with it, that they may vote against it. Angela Rayner also said tonight that discussions are ongoing about any concessions. So it does sound like you're in dialogue about perhaps making changes.
Yeah, of course we are. I think there's a concern that's very valid and real for lots of my colleagues. They're not doing this to cause trouble or to be argumentative. They're doing it because they have a genuine, heartfelt concern about some of the impacts. Now, I think the welfare reforms as being proposed, on the whole, create a huge opportunity to help people that are currently being failed by a broken system, to help people into work if they can work, for those who can't, to provide more security, bigger payments, and scrapping the awful work capability assessments that so demean those people, especially with long-term conditions who we know can't work but need to just be treated better. There's lots in the welfare reforms I think would be supported cross-party. Where there is concerns, that dialogue, those discussions will continue until the vote and beyond.
I'm sort of struggling to work out, how it's got to the stage that, almost 1 in 3 of your MPs are planning on voting against this. I mean, it suggests to me like a breakdown in that relationship between Number 10 and the Parliamentary Party. And, Keir Starmer said today, I was very struck by these comments, are there plenty of people and noises off? Yes, of course, there always are, there always have been, there always will be. I mean, it's just bad politics, isn't it? Dismissing this as kind of noises off. These are the MPs he's trying to win over.
Well, I think doing difficult things means that you have to have difficult conversations. If this was easy...
Do you think it's noises off? Do you think that's what your colleagues are doing, noising off?
I think there are some of my colleagues that have a genuine concern about the impact on some of the most vulnerable in society.
So it's not noises off then?
That is a reasonable concern for a parliamentarian to raise. It's also entirely reasonable for government ministers like myself, and especially those in the Department of Work and Pensions, to engage in constructive dialogue with those folks, because for many of the people, I think they want to know that these welfare reforms, when taken as a whole package, will make it easier and better for some of our most vulnerable people in society, will change and fix what is a hideously broken welfare system. I think everyone, nearly in every party, agrees what we've inherited is not good enough, it is broken. We need to improve that. If it was easy, I think the last lot would have done it. This is hard and difficult, but we've got to make those changes. And even with those changes, we're still spending £16 billion more on welfare than we were at the last general election. So the nation is still supporting people, but if people can work, I think they should be back into work. But to do that, we need to provide genuine more support, and we need more humanity back in our welfare system, and one that actually works. That's what I think these proposals will actually deliver.
Thank you very much indeed. Great to have you on the programme. Luke Pollard speaking to us there. Right, well, let's bring in a duo for the evening, shall we? The former Conservative Minister Tom Pursglove and the former SNP MP Hannah Bardell. Great to have you both on the programme. Hannah, on welfare, how would you vote? What if you were in Westminster now?
I would absolutely 100% be voting against these proposals. I mean, disabled people are 3 times more likely to be in poverty. This is going to put 50,000 more children into poverty. And I've sat with constituents and gone through the PIP assessment, which stands for Personal Independence Payment, and that just allows people like basic dignity and humanity, like support with going to the toilet, changing their beds, going and getting their shopping. I find it remarkable that a Labour Party, now in government, who made so many promises to people who were vulnerable and are going to be affected by this, are not willing to consider a wealth tax. If we put 1% on assets over £10 million, we would have £12 billion more into our economy, and we would be able to spend that.
And Tom?
Well, I thought it was interesting. A lot of the positive things that the Minister touched on there with the welfare reforms are exactly the policies that we were taking forward when we were in government, that right to work guarantee, trying to get rid of those structural barriers to people being in work and the jeopardy that they feel around trying work and then that not working out and losing their entitlement and having to reapply and be reassessed, which are completely wrong and completely perverse. And I think we can all support, for example, not reassessing people where that just isn't appropriate because their condition just isn't likely to improve. But I also think that on the PIP side of this, in particular, the tests that Kemi set out are the right ones. We clearly do need to reduce spend. I think we do need to ensure that we're not raising taxes on working people. But fundamentally, one of the things that I really worry about, and it was a big red line for me, was the way in which, for example, these proposed changes would affect people with incontinence. I think that calls into question a lot of issues around dignity. I'm not sure that this has been well thought through, and I do have some real sympathy with the point that Labour backbenchers are making around consultation with disabled people to try and design a reform that gets it right.
The remarkable thing is, if Labour were in opposition now and the Conservatives were bringing forward these proposals, I, along with others, would be opposing that. They would be opposing these, and I sat in the welfare reform bill with Labour MPs and worked with them to oppose these kinds of measures.
The other part of the interview that I was wanting to pick up with you is that suggestion that things like energy security could be part of defence spending, which I think is interesting, right? And you can understand, the minister there is saying, look, this is part of our resilience, and it's right we look at it. But is this not the problem with putting these hugely ambitious targets like 5%? All the other countries can be at this as well, basically just trying to find whatever spending they can to fit within this defence budget, Tom.
Well, essentially, I sort of respect the minister for coming out and trying to defend this. But rather like Dan Jarvis in your interview last night, just couldn't explain away this 1.5%, which are effectively things that government already does. When you look at the intelligence agencies, I wonder if things like counter-terrorism policing is perhaps included in this. And so what you're actually seeing is a small increase in defence spending, which I welcome. We live in very uncertain times. We've got war on the European continent, everything that's going on in the Middle East. But I do think that ministers need to be candid with the public about some of the difficult spending decisions that this inevitably brings in other areas of government, including, for example, on the welfare side, that they're going to have to make difficult choices in order to fund this. But a lot of this is smoke and mirrors, where actually what we're seeing is a reprofiling of other spend.
Or it's smoke and mirrors to try and appease Trump. And that's what it feels like. It feels like, coming off the back of the NATO summit today, what Mark Rutte said and just what Keir Starmer was saying is all trying to dance to Trump's tune. And unfortunately, because of chronic underfunding in our defence sector, they have handed Trump a Pyrrhic win. And that's to say that he will claim it as a win, but it's not one that we want to be fronting,
Do you think it's right to increase defence spending?
Absolutely. And the SNP called for that for a long time. And I personally believe in the notion of increasing spending. What it is spent on, however, is a very important matter. It shouldn't be on, more international misadventure in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, or sending our troops out not properly resourced or funded. And it certainly shouldn't be spent on arming places like Israel to drop bombs and genocide in Palestine. And I think that the public want to know what this money is being spent on. I think we all recognise that the threats are increasingly sophisticated, but I think we also recognise that for a very long time. I remember when Scottish troops were out fighting under, the Black Watch in Iraq, and their regiment was disbanded and turned into the Royal Regiment of Scotland. That's our history in places, and that is our history. And you think about veterans, and where is the more support for veterans? And some of those veterans will be impacted by these disability cuts. So we need to be investing and thinking about that as well.
Tom, what's your take?
Talk is easy, isn't it? And there's been many false dawns on this agenda over the years. Again, as I say, I welcome an increase in spending on defence, as Hannah has said, for many of the same reasons. But we've been here before. This goes right back to the time of Obama's presidency, where he was stressing the need for increased defence spending, other countries stepping up. I thought that Donald Trump's...
People will be shouting at the TV saying, the Conservatives had 14 years to increase defence spending. What would you say to them?
Well, we did come forward with a plan, and there were very vocal proponents of that in government, like Ben Wallace, whose judgment I massively respect on these issues. I think one area that was really important today that Donald Trump did say was probably the most forward-leaning that he's been around collective defence, that really important principle that here in the UK we really believe in and that we shout from the rooftops about, and quite rightly, that need to work together to protect one another. But we need to see the money actually flow. You need to see the right investments in the right kit. There's an argument around the reprofiling of the F-35 programme. For example, this will mean that it is our aircraft that will be able to carry US nuclear missiles. That is obviously a change relative to where we've been before in relation to that programme. And you've also seen some outliers. So, for example, the Spanish today have been holding out. So this has not been a complete success, and we actually need to see the proof in the pudding, which is actually the spending. OK,
thanks both very much indeed. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, the Prime Minister commits to raising defence spending to 5%, but unless there's new money, it's all smoke and mirrors. We'll hear from the Shadow Defence Secretary, James Cartledge. That's next.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Hello, welcome back. Well, certainly from Donald Trump's point of view, the NATO summit will be seen as a success, and allies, including the UK, have heeded his call to increase defence spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. But of course, as we've been discussing on the programme, where's the money going to come from? Will it mean a tough choice between raising taxes or more spending cuts? Well, just before coming on air, I spoke to the Shadow Defence Secretary, James Cartledge. Thank you very much for being on the programme. So the government's committed to spending 5% of GDP on defence. Is that something you welcome?
I mean, in principle, the fact that NATO has announced this new target and that other countries in particular are going to spend more is fantastic. My big worry about what this means for the UK is we just don't know the detail. I was both a Treasury Minister and a Defence Minister, and in the MOD, they want to know that the Treasury has actually got a plan, because you can't spend money unless you know the Treasury's accounted for it. And at the moment, we only know the actual spend figure up to 2029. We don't know anything beyond that. So all of these things are great, but are they actually going to happen?
The 5% as well is obviously an increase on the 3.5% that the government originally committed to. And I was interested in looking at the detail of it, because 1.5% of that 5 is on national resilience.
Yes.
Do you think that's right, or do you think it should all be on the core defence?
So I think this is classic smoke and mirrors. I mean, this National Resilience Fund, as we understand, I mean, the Prime Minister on another channel yesterday said that money is already being spent. Well, it's not in the defence budget, so that must mean it's things like, I presume, broadband and energy and so on. We don't yet know. We want to see the detail. But that feels to me like a bit of a cheap play, quite frankly. That money needs to be in the defence budget. If it was really 5%, that's 1985 when we spent 5% GDP on defence. We had 330,000, regular personnel. We had, I think, 600 or so combat planes, a vastly bigger military. Whereas this 5%, people will hear that and think, wow, a bigger military. Whereas in reality, the 1.5% is stuff we're already spending now, so you won't see any difference. And the 3.5% is actually going to be only guaranteed to be about 2.4, because we don't know how they're going to pay for the rest of it.
You know, at the same time, though, like, you know, you have to have some sympathy with the Treasury and with the government here as well, because, look, every department is crying out.
The money's got to come from
somewhere.
somewhere.
We're all paying an awful lot of money in taxation, right? You know, so you've been the Treasury Minister.
Yes,
it's easy to shout from the sidelines, whether you are, you know, a military man or an opposition MP. They've got to work it out, right?
The thing is, I'm not shouting from the sidelines. I'm a patriot. I want the country to spend more. I want our armed forces to be stronger because I genuinely worry about the threat we face. But it has to be said, by their own admission, they have no plan to spend any of this, where this money's going to come from. And you're right, it has to come from somewhere, and we're probably going to have a pretty big discussion as a country about things like welfare.
Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But just on defence, the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has said today this announcement of new UK jets carrying nuclear weapons is not as it seems, because he's saying the jets wouldn't be carrying UK weapons, they'd carry American weapons, so that wouldn't make us safer. I mean, do you agree with Ben Wallace there?
Well, obviously, I'm a massive fan of Ben Wallace. I worked for him when he was Secretary of State. I think the point he's making is about it wouldn't be an independent, what we call tactical nuclear weapon. So at the moment we have a strategic deterrent, which is the submarine. That would be used in the most extreme circumstances that we hope never occur. These are tactical nuclear weapons. It's a slightly lower threshold, which you still hope wouldn't occur because it would still be pretty serious. And the point he's making is it's like a joint NATO mission that we would join. Now, if it's joint, it wouldn't surprise you perhaps if there is joint control to a certain extent, and it is with the US. That's very normal in NATO for us. So my view is this is a good thing. It does enhance our deterrent capability. But my question would be, should we perhaps also look at whether we can have a more sovereign UK tactical nuclear capability alongside it, like we had in 1985 when we spent 5%?
I mean, do you think these are things that would ever be used? Tactical nuclear weapons?
I sincerely hope not. The reason they are there and the way in which they are used every day is to deter. You know, if you want to avoid war, all history shows the only way to do that is to deter your adversary in the first place by having things like nuclear weapons, which you hope never to use, but hopefully stop them from aggression.
You mentioned there about welfare, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about the welfare bill. We're, of course, expecting a big rebellion by Labour MPs on that. Do you think the Conservatives should vote in favour of those cuts to benefits?
Well, as you know, our leader, Kemi Badenoch, set 3 tests about whether she would determine whether she would support the Prime Minister. And I think that's the right thing to do. You can't just give a blank cheque at the end of the day. We're there to hold them to account. And I think the really key point she's making is the first look at this policy looks a bit like a sort of knee-jerk way to save money, not a big, thought-out, comprehensive reform of the welfare system, which is actually what we need, not least because, Sophie, I think it shows not a single extra person will come off benefits and into work, which is actually the way to save money.
You see, I don't really understand this, honestly. You know, I think that you're either for this policy because you think that we're spending too much money on sickness benefits and more people are going to come off it, or you're against it because you think it's balancing the books on the backs of the poorest, right? These are 2 legitimate positions to have. You're setting these tests and hurdles. Can't you just be true to yourself?
No.
Why don't you just say whether you support it or not?
So when you speak to people about welfare, to voters on the doorstep, they say to you, we do need to get it down, but the people who really need it still need to receive it. That's effectively what we're saying. We want to check, are you taking payments off people who are severely disabled, for example? I don't think anyone would support that. Where the savings need to come from in welfare, and they are substantial potentially, is getting the huge rise in working age claims for disability benefit back into work.
So that's the point. So do you support the changes to payments or not? That's the point,
she set a test, because as we understand...
Yes, so her text is including not having any tax rises. I mean, you can say we don't believe in tax rises because we're Conservatives, but that's a whole different argument. You're talking here about changes to payments. Do you support it or not? Because right now it looks like you're playing politics.
Well, I said she set these 3 tests. The reason is because we do want to reform welfare. We want to see substantial savings from it. But if this has suddenly been come up very quickly and is like a half-cooked policy where the only savings are from people who... we're not saying take it off everybody. If there are people who really are severe cases who need benefits, then of course we shouldn't be taking it off them. And I think the country understands that. But what we all know is there's been a very large increase in people of working age, where I think most people think after a while they should be back in work. There's plenty of jobs out there still. It's getting tougher, unfortunately, because some of the steps Labour have taken. But, I think that's where the country would be, and that's where we are. So we want to know that will be the case. So we're looking at this carefully, and I think that's a reasonable and balanced approach.
OK, when are you going to let us know then?
Kemi set the test, that's for her to say.
OK, thanks very much. Well, staying with welfare, it does look like the government is going to try and tackle the Labour rebels head-on, despite more than 120 MPs now confirming their support for what's called a reasoned amendment, which would effectively block the Prime Minister's welfare cuts if the Commons votes in favour. Well, that vote will go ahead next week, as confirmed by both Sir Keir Starmer and his deputy, Angela Rayner. Our political correspondent, Ali Fortescue, is with me now. Ali, you've been talking to MPs, trying to pick up the temperature in the House of Commons. What have you been gleaning?
I think what's really interesting is that, these are MPs from all different parts of the Labour Party, new MPs, old MPs, but a lot of the ones I've spoken to, these are not the usual rebels. These are often new MPs that tell me they really did not want to have to rebel on this, and tell me that actually they're happy with quite a lot of the bill, but it's more the way that it's been handled. This was one MP who said the way that it was driven by the Treasury, and those words actually have echoed a lot of the conversations I've had. They think that this has all been about saving money, and yeah, it is about saving money, £5 billion a year by 2030, the government want to save on this, but they think that there needs to be more consultation, basically, that people, disabled people, haven't been consulted enough. The Prime Minister says he's comfortable reading the room. That's what he said at the NATO summit. But you've got to ask the question, what room is he reading?
Yeah, this does feel quite important, doesn't it? Like, he was describing it as noises off. I mean, what do you think it says about the kind of relationship between Keir Starmer and Number 10 and then the parliamentary party?
It almost sounded a bit dismissive, and I don't think it went down particularly well with some of the MPs that I have spoken to. And, you also have that kind of tension because he's speaking at NATO. He wants to talk about the money that's being spent on defence, but all the questions, including from Beth Rigby, almost all the questions, were about a domestic issue, about welfare, about where they're saving, not spending money. And that was what dominated the chamber as well today when we had Deputy Prime Minister's questions and Mel Stride taking on Angela Rayner. Have a listen to this.
If ever we needed a reminder of the party opposite having no shames, it's their demands for this bill, Mr Speaker. He demands a programme to help people into work, exactly what this bill does. After he left 1 in 8 young people out of the economy, he demands no new taxes from the party that raised taxes to record levels, and he demands further welfare savings, Mr Speaker, from the man who was in charge as the welfare bill absolutely ballooned.
There will be a vote in this House on Tuesday on the welfare bill, although many on the back benches could be forgiven for thinking they've heard this before with the winter fuel payment, where they were marched up the hill, and we all know where that story ended. But, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we are absolutely clear. We will help her to get their bill through if they can commit to actually reducing the welfare bill and getting people off benefits and into work.
It's interesting, actually, since that interview this evening, speaking to ITV, Angela Rayner said that basically said that discussions about concessions are ongoing. And as I say, the sense I get from those, this is a quarter, more than a quarter, nearly a third of Labour MPs that are publicly saying they're going to rebel. I mean, it's extraordinary. As I say, it's about money, but it's also about politics. Prime Minister that wants to show he can get his agenda for change through Parliament, that he's not at the mercy of his MPs, that this is a break from what we saw when the Conservatives were in power. I mean, it's serious, even if he sounded dismissive in public. We know behind the scenes cabinet ministers have been calling MPs. One MP was told by a minister that defeat would trigger a leadership contest. That is how serious some of what has been said behind the scenes is. The government say publicly, this is not a matter that it's not a confidence matter. So it's extraordinary. It's serious, Sophie.
1 in 3 MPs almost. It is actually really is quite extraordinary. Ali, thank you very much indeed. Ali Fortescue there, bringing us up to speed on the welfare debate, and of course that story is sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers as well. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the Daily Mirror columnist Kevin Maguire and also the political commentator, someone you might have heard of, Adam Bolton. Right to the crisis in our prisons now, and new plans to deport foreign criminals at an earlier point in their sentence to ease overcrowding, an issue, of course, we've been covering very closely on the Politics Hub. So currently, foreign inmates with no right to stay in the UK are sent back to their home country after serving half of their sentence, but under the new plans, they would be removed after just 30% of that term. Well, Sky's Molly Malone is here with more. So, Molly, what's the idea behind this?
Well, the backdrop, as we know, is a prison overcrowding crisis. Remember, the male prison estate at the moment is 98% full. So that's the kind of context that they're operating in. This is effectively another early release measure. We've heard a lot about them recently, haven't we? We've heard all sorts of different criminals set to be released early to try and ease the pressure in prison. And this one will mean that probably as of September, it's going through Parliament at the moment, will come into force in September. Foreign criminals can be deported, so sent back to their home country after having served 30% of their sentence rather than 50%, which is what the policy is at the moment. The government say once it comes into force in September, it will free up about 500 spaces a year. They say that foreign criminals make up about 12% of the total prison population. So it's not insignificant numbers. That's quite a lot of people in England and Wales. However, there are a few howevers. Firstly, I'd say, as prison policy goes, this is a politically quite easy one. That's because we've got Reform talking about having a national minister for deportations. We've got the opposition, Robert Jenrick, talking about this very issue quite regularly. He says that we need to be deporting all foreign nationals. So it's kind of politically expedient, as you like. It's an easy one to sort of sell to the public, I guess. But sources in the prison service suggest that actually it might not be that effective at easing the kind of population. The reality is that there's going to be quite a few exclusions, so anyone convicted of a terrorist offence will be excluded. And effectively, it will actually be a kind of measure that might not be that easy in terms of there'll be lots of kind of restrictions. So it excludes, deportation can be refused if there's evidence a prisoner is planning to commit further crime. Now, that's a difficult kind of threshold to prove, and actually would mean excluding quite a lot of people. When you're talking about 500 spaces a year, if you're rapidly, quite quickly coming down from that, you're perhaps not doing that much to ease the prison population, which right now, we're talking about right now, is in crisis.
Really interesting stuff. Molly Malone speaking there. We can just bring in Tom and Hannah as well. Tom, what do you make of this policy? Is it something that you agree with?
Well, you won't find me complaining about getting rid of foreign criminals out of our jails. That is something that I absolutely support. The only concern that I really have in this is with changing that threshold, I think it is so important that victims of crime feel engaged and consulted in that process. Because one of the big concerns that I used to hear as a constituency MP, but also when I was in government, was victims of crime particularly worried about individuals who'd committed sometimes the most horrendous crimes against them and their families and their loved ones, potentially being out on the street and doing harm to others. And I think they would worry a lot about, for example, someone being removed very early on in their sentence, being transferred back to country of origin and then able to just go scot-free. So there's a very fine balance here. And I'm also sceptical, rather, about all the ECHR elements that will no doubt come into this, Article 3, Article 8, all those things that have been such a barrier to removals. So I think there's some practical hurdles here, as well as getting that right with victims.
Hannah, we've done quite a lot on prisons on the Politics Hub. We did some filming in Preston Prison and one of the most overcrowded prisons in the country. And just the cycle of reoffending and the kids coming in at like 18, 19, and then just coming in every 3 years again and again and again. Yeah. It feels quite broken.
Totally. I mean, this is going after the symptom, not the cause. And we have a huge challenge, across the UK in terms of our prison population, why so many people reoffend, why so many people are on a cycle. I met a guy recently in the gym, actually, and he had been an offender himself. He'd got out of prison and he'd set up a housing association. And he was telling me just about the massive challenges that prisoners face when they come out. And many of them want to reform themselves. They want to get back on an even footing. They want to see their families, but they can't get a house because we've got a housing crisis, and they can't get any support. So they end up falling back into similar habits. And so actually what we should be doing is focusing energy and resource on improving prison facilities, yes, but actually focusing on rehabilitation, because we are so far away from the international standards on what... And I sat on the Council of Europe for 7 years and heard a lot of stuff about incredibly pioneering work that's happening in other European nations that we could be emulating. There are some great programmes that go on in prisons, but there's so much more that we could do to support prisoners get out. Now, I'm not saying that we should not, absolutely, as Tom says, engage with victims, but I just don't believe that this is going to tackle the challenge that we'll have. Also, it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, and we also need to look at the kind of things. I mean, we've just had a campaign group, Palestinian campaign group, prescribed by the UK government, which is remarkable, and we may end up in a situation where people who are, foreign nationals are just looking to protest something, they end up becoming criminals, and then they end up being deported.
I mean, you make so many important points about rehabilitation, about support, housing, all these kind of things. It's kind of a difficult political sell, right?
Not easy, but it's the right thing to do, and there is nothing decent or right by the taxpayer in not having durable solutions for people when they come out of prison. And Hannah's absolutely right. The housing challenge is massively up there.
You've spoken about this before.
Exactly, and I've spent a bit of time talking to people in the sector in recent months, and so many times when you talk to the experts who deliver that rehabilitation, they say it so often falls down because the housing bit just isn't there. But also, we ought to be looking at what we can do to try and relocate prisoners to be closer to home so that there is that network of support to be able to get into a job, to be able to sort things like school places and housing out so that people don't get back into that cycle of reoffending.
Or even earlier than that, the fundamental causes of how poverty, inequality, these are massive drivers of crime.
Absolutely, really important discussion. Thank you both very much indeed. Still to come on the Politics Hub. As Glastonbury throws open its gates, we're going to look at why the usual festival goers might be joined by a fair few little ravers from Westminster.
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8, a man who killed a teenager during a drug-induced sword rampage is convicted of his murder, with the police officers who ran towards the danger praised for preventing anyone else from being killed. Also tonight, we'll be discussing the UK's new fleet of fighter jets capable of carrying nuclear weapons. And a rise Sir Gareth, the former England manager, picking up his knighthood from an old friend. All that and much more to come on the UK Tonight at 8.
First Minister, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
Nice to see you.
How are you feeling? Looking forward to getting into the parliamentary chamber.
Are you any further forward to making a decision?
I'm not. No, it's an important day today.
All of the claims were in line with my parliamentary duties, so I'm making that clear to you, Conor.
He was a Scot through and through.
He was a very good politician.
Alex Salmond was controversial, he was a disruptor, but above all, he was respected.
Will you resign if you lose this week?
Again, I'm not planning to, of course, lose the vote of no confidence. I'm planning to win that vote of no confidence.
His face said it all.
My intention to stand down as party leader.
This is now a storm with deadly consequences. How are they feeling?
They're a bit scared at the minute.
We've been told to evacuate.
How are you feeling?
Devastated.
Hundreds of homes were wiped out by flooding. I'm Conor Gillis, Sky's Scotland correspondent.
It was probably the darkest time in my life.
Scott is 5 years sober after a cocaine addiction left him close to death. Scotland has a shameful record, worse than England, the worst in Europe.
Why not just say you failed? Because then you might get more respect from families who've lost loved ones.
This is where one of the UK's most prolific rapists thought he'd got away with murder.
Sky News can reveal that former sex workers had told police he was sexually violent.
My Emma.
Free wherever you get your news.
It's over, isn't it?
The Americans say he is Rossi, a fraudster.
This has been one of the most bizarre cases ever heard in a courtroom in this country.
A dangerous murderer.
Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Andrew Ennis after this?
She said she can forgive him, but as long as he's behind bars.
By doing the right thing, it's destroyed your life.
They terrorised me. They intimidated me.
I'm so grateful.
Sky News, the full story first.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Well, Glastonbury has opened its doors for another year, and among the crowds will, I'm sure, be a fair few MPs. And of course, we all need to get away from it sometimes and let our hair down, so who can really blame them? But it has got us thinking, of course, about some of the, I guess, familiar faces that you might end up seeing at Glastonbury, from Jeremy Corbyn being mobbed on the Pyramid stage to Angela Rayner giving it large in Ibiza. Let's have a look now, shall we, at some of Westminster's finest living their best life in a muddy field.
This is a crowd that couldn't be more sympathetic to Jeremy Corbyn, but it isn't exactly representative of the country. And in many ways, I think a lot of people watching this will just see it as one more giant selfie in front of a vast crowd.
That final Michael Gove, I should clarify, not at Glastonbury, but too good for us not to play again, right? You've got to do it. I love the little Stamcoat sneaking in there as well. You guys tempted heading down there, getting your tents out?
Well, now that we're not politicians and we won't be criticised for it, I think it's quite funny, actually, because I have the same view about these things as I do about things like online dating. You know, I remember telling somebody I was online dating and they were like, what? You're a politician? And I'm like, well, it's funny that before you get elected, people talk about wanting normal people. They want their politicians to look like them, sound like them, act like them, do the same stuff, and then you get elected and you do those things, and then you're suddenly criticised. So I don't
think wrong with Glastonbury. I think absolutely fair.
I never went. Tea in the Park was my bag.
I think that politicians going need to make sure that they pay for their tickets, because with welfare reform and with Freebie Gate, that is not a great look. I mean, look, I've actually got common ground with Harriet Harman on this, and on the Electoral Dysfunction podcast, had a really good discussion about tents. I'm just not up for that.
You're not up for tents?
It's just the whole, hygiene and all the rest of it. No, not for me. Not one for me. I'm sure it's great fun, but I just don't fancy it.
A tent at a music festival, I just have to say, as a hardened camper in the Scottish Highlands, is very different to a tent in the Highlands.
It is true. I am not a camper at all, but I do love a festival. I'm gonna go. Actually.
Are you going to camp?
Yeah, I'm going.
Good on you.
Yeah, I'm going. Yeah, I've got my little sort of tiny 2-man tent. I'm a terrible camper. Like, some people have got all the stuff, the glamping. Yeah. I'm definitely.
You're going hardcore.
Yeah, I'm kind of hardcore.
I'm up for the hotel for a week by a beach. That's what I'm up for this summer.
Very sensible. Very, very sensible. Thanks both very much indeed. Always great to have you on The Politics Hub. Well, that is it for us tonight. We'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Up next is the UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee. And then, of course, you've got 9 p.m. The World with Yada Hakeem. But I'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Thanks for joining us here on The Politics Hub.